Joining us now to discuss the impact that the upcoming elections will have on businesses, Kevin Lings, Chief Economist at Stanlib. Kevin, lovely to have you at the desk. We're 6 weeks away from the 7th of May. What's this environment likely to be like for businesses leading up to 7th of May?
Look, at the moment it's a fairly tough environment for domestic business. We know that economic activity generally under pressure. Remember, we still got the strike in the platinum industry. I think that's in its 8th week. Business confidence is low, consumer confidence is low. So domestically, we're already in a fairly tough environment, and obviously as you go closer to the election, you've got all of this policy uncertainty. In other words, you're not quite sure where we're going to go post the election. And what that tends to do is that business starts to go a little bit on hold. By that I mean they don't really move ahead with expansion plans. They don't move ahead with any big investment initiative. They would rather wait and see how this unfolds, what the landscape looks like, also what the economic environment looks like, and then make more firmer decisions post that.
But are there any indications that there could be any change, one, in administration, or two, any big policy deviation that would really make businesses and investors want to sort of sit on the sidelines?
There is quite a big focus on the implementation of the National Development Plan. So let me just quickly explain. It's quite key. Obviously, the government has made the National Development Plan a focus. It's part of the ANC election manifesto. It's been endorsed by the cabinet. It's been endorsed by rating agencies, by the IMF, etc. They all quite like the tone of the plan. What's critical, and what's going to be critical, is that after the election, that government starts to implement. In other words, we don't really have the space for another plan and another discussion about another plan. What we're looking for is actual implementation of a number of issues.
Or a discussion of this plan. I mean, they have been discussing this plan for a long time, and depending on who you talk to in government, there's a different emphasis and so on. Just looking at strategically, if you like, for the government, for the ruling ANC, they are clearly a bit nervous about Julius Malema and the EFF, the Economic Freedom Fighters, partly from a populist point of view, and partly from a policy point of view. He's making outlandish promises which people in suits would say, well, no, that's not, you can't do that, but the people out there might like the sound of it. So do you perceive a left-leaning, nervous ANC in that respect?
Well, to me, that's the key point. In other words, it's clear that the ANC is going to lose some of their support to the Economic Freedom Fighters, and that means you've lost some of your support to a more left-wing leaning organization. The concern will be post the election. If the ANC feels that they've lost a lot of support and they've lost a lot of popular support, what policies do they then implement? Do they continue to implement a go for growth, a business-friendly, a national development plan? Or do they feel, oh no, we need to get some of that popular support back? And they themselves start to introduce more populist measures, which takes them away from the National Development Plan. Remember, the rating agencies are looking at us closely. They've all indicated they're going to review our credit ratings shortly after the election. And what they're looking for is the composition of cabinet. Who do we put in the key positions? Who's the Minister of Finance? Who's the Minister of Trade and Industry? Where does Cyril Ramaphosa fit in? These types of things are going to be looked at very carefully. And what they're going to be looking at is, do we go for growth? Do we go for infrastructure? Do we go for reforms within the labor legislation? Or do we try and embark on a more populist measure to try and bring back some of the support away from EFF? And if we go more populist, I think the pushback from the rating agencies will be quite significant, and you run the risk of a credit rating downgrade, because it would look like you're not implementing growth. And given that our budget is under pressure, tax revenues under pressure, government spending under pressure, it would not be seen as a good outcome. So to me, that's the most critical thing. Do we forcefully implement National Development Plan post-election, or do we go with a more vague implementation that leaves a lot of ambiguity as to the real direction?
For the first time in a democratic South Africa, we're also going into an election where the IEC has a question of credibility hanging over its head. International community rating agencies, investors, are they a bit nervous right now about this institution that is the custodian of the electoral process?
Sure, it's come up for debate, but I would say that in the list of factors that they're considering, it's not the key factor. And clearly the election will be watched to see that it goes ahead smoothly. And from my perspective, I don't think there's much doubt about that. If you look at what's top of their list, it's much more to do with broadly government finances, the labour situation, social pressure, social delivery or service delivery strikes, strikes. These are, for them, much, much bigger issues. And clearly, South Africa has to move the country in a direction that says we're going to grow this economy. That's what you want to see unequivocally at this stage. And I think that's what will placate the rating agencies.
Yeah, and maybe the danger is that government will increase the role of the state and say we can do everything, we can create jobs. The other problem, Kevin, is that we're always in election mode. People say there's an election every 5 years, but it's not just every 5 years. The municipal elections were in 2011. Now that affects the whole country.
Yeah.
The national and provincial affect the whole country. In between those is an ANC elective conference.
That's
so
right.
actually the ANC is always in election mode. Another one just round the corner. I think we're set for another 5 years of this.
Well, that's right. We do have these local government elections as well. So you have got this constant focus on it. And I guess that takes you away from the real issues, which is trying to implement many of these policies. And we know that when we get closer to the election, the rhetoric goes up, the uncertainty, the volatility goes up, market participants get a little bit more nervous. So it's not exactly all that helpful. It seems clear to us that what we don't need in this country is more and more policy debate. We just need a much more simplistic policy. I would argue that the National Development Plan is way too complex in its structure. It needs to be simplified.
Of course, the danger there is that you choose only the bits that everyone agrees on,
yes,
which is not the point.
You can, and pretty much that plan, I mean, I'm not sure that you should call it a plan, but that document is so broad that it covers every single aspect that you can pick and choose as you see fit. And there are areas that are fairly populist and other areas that are pro-business, etc. So to me, it's quite critical that we distill the National Development Plan down into literally 1 or 2 or 3 points, that we make those very clear, we simplify it a lot, and then we say that's the bits we're going to implement.
Let's talk about Gauteng. I mean, the last numbers I saw, I think over the weekend, predictions that the ANC is likely to get only about 45% of this particular province. We're talking about the economic hub of the country. What are the possible scenarios that could play out in terms of partnerships and coalitions between the smaller parties?
Look, I think Gauteng is probably the most interesting in terms of the election outcome because it's such a significant province. And there is some possibility the ANC loses the majority, and then obviously they would, under those circumstances, have to form a coalition, and then they would have the choice between the EFF and the DA, and that doesn't seem like a really easy choice for the ANC at that point. My suspicion, if that's happened, they would go with the EFF and see how that gets managed. And I think what this is telling us, look, I don't think that that's actually what's going to happen. I think the ANC will get the majority in Gauteng, but it's telling us that we're getting closer and closer to coalition type governments, whether it's the national government or whether it's ultimately a provincial government. If you think about how the Western Cape transformed, that initially it was a coalition and then it became DA, and I think you'll see that in other local government elections. And so this politics of coalition, I think over the coming years, is going to be a feature.